Evil and Omnipotence by J.L. Mackie. Before we begin, I would just like to offer a warning. The following presentation, at least the first 6 slides of it, contains some graphic images that may be disturbing to some individuals. So if that's the case, you may want to sort of fast forward through these first few sections. Evil. Mackie's argument on the relationship between evil and omnipotence depends upon 3 assumptions. The first assumption is an assumption about the world. It's an assumption that evil exists in the world. And so as long as we accept that, and as long as we accept the 2 assumptions that he makes about a divine being, then the problem of evil, as it's sort of classically defined, presents a problem for our belief in an all-good, all-powerful God. So I want to start this by just pointing out the examples of evil in the world. And this is where, again, for some this may be disturbing. So I just want to show a few examples. So if you doubt that there's evil in the world, it's not hard to find sort of counterexamples to that doubt. For example, lynchings in both the North and South, lynchings in which children are brought to observe this going on. Right? If that isn't evil, I don't know what is. Right? We have other examples. I'm sure many of you can think of the Holocaust, right, where 3 to 5 million Jews, along with a number of other minority groups, up to 6 million, were killed. Mass sort of killing of human beings, right? Mass killings. And so if you want to say that the world doesn't have evil in it, you have to explain how this is not evil. An example that you might not be aware of, several years ago, this is Susan Smith. Susan Smith put her 2 children in the car and sort of ran the car into a lake within a minute where they drowned. And then she attempted to blame it on a black man, claiming that she had been kidnapped and the car had been taken, and that's what happened to her children. She also said that she was told to do it. She had voices, so there's all kinds of issues. There's questions of whether that was actually true, whether she was faking that. But at the end of the day, she killed her 2 children, in this sort of horrific way, allowing them to drown. A more recent example, 9/11. Right? We look at the loss of 3,000 lives in the Twin Towers, along with the people in the airplanes that crashed. And we said this horrific event was for an ideology, right? So couched in religion, but still, when you look and you see examples of evil, people point to things like this. And it's much worse elsewhere in the world as well, right? There are other sorts of examples of sort of terrorist attacks and bombings and so forth that we can point to. And as if that wasn't bad enough, we can look at the Sandy Hook Elementary School, right, where kindergartners, 5, 6-year-old children, were shot and killed. Of all individuals, one would ask, who would find young children offensive? Right? There are all kinds of reasons or motivations people might have to kill, might even engage in terrorist acts. They can sort of rationalize, but in what way can you rationalize the killing of small children? So if you're going to look at the world, and we're going to assume that there's evil in the world, if you want to object to that and say, no, what's in the world is not actually evil, then you're going to have to offer an explanation. So what Mackie does, and those who present the problem of evil or buy into the problem of evil, is that we accept as a condition that there is in fact evil in the world. Now we'll address whether or not you can respond this way or respond to this assumption later on in the lecture. But to begin with, I just want to point out that there's ample evidence, and I'm sure all of you could come up with additional examples of what would be considered evil in the world. Now, the classic problem of evil starts with that assumption. Right? It says, look, if I look around me in the world, I see evil acts. I see a number of evil acts. I see things that aren't just bad, aren't just really bad, but actually rise to the level of what we would call evil. Now, we don't have to have a religious base for evil or basis for evil, right? We can just use the word evil in the sense that there is something so horrific, so bad, that the word bad doesn't capture it, that immoral doesn't capture it, that we need something. This is fundamentally, this is just universally accepted as a wrong or as a bad. So when we talk about the classic problem of evil, we start with that assumption that those types of acts exist in the world, right? So there's evil in the world. So what else does the sort of argument, the classic argument from evil or problem of evil do? Well, one, it concedes that God exists. So let's start with the assumption there's evil in the world, and let's concede that there is some way to prove or establish that God exists. So it could be a non-rational way, right? It could just be, I've got a personal sense that there's a God. I feel that there's something has spoken to me, a religious sort of experience. Anything you want, any sort of intuition that establishes God is fine. So the problem of evil concedes, okay, there is a God. We're not going to argue. I'm not going to try to prove. So as in our other readings, we're talking about Anselm, Aquinas, and Paley, and so forth. They're attempting to prove God exists in order to convince the non-believer. In the problem of evil, that's not an issue. We're going to concede that God exists for this argument. The problem of evil means that religious believers must engage, says Mackie, in an extreme form of irrationality. So the extreme form of irrationality is to accept a certain conception of God and to also accept that there's evil in the world. In other words, to hold those two ideas together, as we'll see, is a contradiction. And to hold that contradiction is irrational. To say that two things can be true when they can't both be true at the same time, says Mackie, is irrational. And so for Mackie, the result is the God of Judeo-Christianity does not exist. Now, to be clear, Mackie's argument doesn't necessarily lead to the fact that no God exists. It's just that the God of Judeo-Christianity does not exist. Right? So we want to be clear that some use a similar sort of argument, the problem of evil, to establish the non-existence of a divine being, where Mackie is making a more modest claim, just that this particular type of God doesn't exist. Leaves open the possibility of another type of God. So let's get to that sort of argument. So the argument is as follows. God is omnipotent, God is all good, and religious believers hold both positions. So this isn't the actual argument. Let me sort of go back. These are the assumptions. God is omnipotent, which just means all-powerful, right? So we have an all-powerful God in the Judeo-Christian God. The Judeo-Christian God is all good, right? We don't believe the Judeo-Christian God is flawed in some way, is sometimes bad. No, this is an all-good, all-loving God. And we hold that religious believers hold both positions. All right, these are a position that religious believers hold both of these simultaneously. Now, as it stands, there's no problem with those two positions. I can have an all-powerful and all-good God without any contradiction. So at this point, there's nothing we're conceding the existence of God, and we're conceding an existence of this type of Judeo-Christian God. Now, there's some additional assumptions, some sort of subsidiary assumptions. And these are corollaries, if you will, right? So if you have an all-good God and an all-powerful God, then these things also follow. A good thing attempts to eliminate evil as far as it can. So just if we look at our concept of good, and especially an all-powerful good being, we would say a good thing is going to attempt to eliminate evil, right? Good things wouldn't want to foster evil. They would like to get rid of evil. An omnipotent thing is all-powerful. Well, that's just by definition. So if you have an omnipotent thing that's all-powerful, and that omnipotent thing is also a good thing, then an omnipotent thing should be able to eliminate all evil. In other words, if we have an all-powerful God, then this all-powerful God can obviously get rid of all evil. Right? There is no evil force in this world that an all-powerful God couldn't defeat. Right? That couldn't eliminate. So when we take our general assumption, there's evil in the world, and then we have our concession that God exists, and this God is both all-powerful and all-good, then it seems that an omnipotent being should be able to eliminate evil in the world. And here's where the argument of evil comes in, and here's why Mackie will hold that the religious believer, to hold both views, that evil exists and that there's an all-powerful and all-good being, results in a form of irrationality. So the argument from evil goes as follows. God is omnipotent, all-powerful. God is wholly good. Evil exists. And the problem for Mackie and for those who sort of put forth the problem of evil is that you can't hold all three of these simultaneously, right? So it's impossible to say that I have an all-powerful God, an all-good God, and still have evil in the world. And this is, in a nutshell, the problem of evil. So what are the implications? Why is it? So if you don't see it right off the bat, you're not looking at it and saying, I see exactly why these things contradict. Let's look at the conclusion, right? So if God is all-powerful, then God should be able to get rid of evil. So if God can't get rid of evil, so let's keep premise 2 here and say God is wholly good. So we have an all-good God, but what we're going to do is say, but that God doesn't get rid of evil. Well, if that's the case, then it appears that God is not all-powerful. So you can't hold that God is all-powerful but is unable to get rid of evil. That would limit the power of God, right? So there's an issue. Now, if I hold that God is all-powerful, say, no, of course God is all-powerful. I can't argue with that. God created the universe. This is an all-powerful being. Well, then, if evil exists and God is all-powerful, then it must be that God is not wholly good. In other words, God allows evil. God allows suffering and allows pain, even though God could get rid of that suffering. So if we looked at ourselves, and if I said, if I had the ability to stop someone's suffering, and that ability, in fact, didn't even threaten my well-being, and clearly, as a godlike being, that would be true, but imagine I could actually help someone where it would not affect me in a negative way in any way, and I allowed that person to suffer, then it seems that I would not be a good person. And so if we maintain omnipotence and we allow for evil, then it must follow from that God is just not good. God doesn't care enough to end our suffering, or at least the suffering of some people. And it doesn't, and that God, by the way, doesn't care enough to end the suffering of, say, the children that were killed at Sandy Hook, or the millions of people killed in the Holocaust, or the thousands of people that were lynched in the South, or in the North for that matter. God just doesn't care enough, right? God isn't wholly good. Now, we could deny that evil exists, that God is all good and God is all powerful, but then we'd need an explanation of why those evil things that I just pointed out aren't actually evil. In other words, there must be some good to those things. There must be some good to children dying in a mass shooting. And that's what you would have to argue. So this is why the argument from evil poses a problem for the Judeo-Christian conception of God, because you've got two very common, regardless of which sect of Christianity or Judaism you buy into, you definitely believe that God is all-powerful, and you would definitely believe that God is good. Even if that goodness is a form of justice, right? If you think it's a just God, a good God, if we can sort of modify what we mean by good in that sense. But at the end of the day, this is what sort of follows. So this is the problem of evil. So the conclusions we draw is God can eliminate evil and chooses not to do so. Therefore, God is not all good, right? So I mentioned that. God can't eliminate evil and is therefore not omnipotent. Or 3, there's just no such thing as evil. Now, the problem of evil poses a problem for this particular Judeo-Christian conception of God. All right, so how do we answer this sort of challenge, right? Is it just that we do have to give up one of those two attributes of God, right? Is omnipotence or is all goodness? Or is it that we have to somehow get rid of the notion that there is evil in the world? Now, there have been attempts to solve this problem of evil. All right, so people have offered responses to this argument. And I want to go over some of those responses now. And this, again, also comes from Mackie and the responses that he claims others have made, and then he responds to those as well. So I'm going to call these fallacious solutions because, as Mackie notes, that none of these actually solve the problem, right? The problem still remains as to how we can hold these three positions at the same time, simultaneously. So one of the options is to argue that good cannot exist without evil. Right? So in order to discern between good and evil, right, to be able to make that distinction, I've got to have something to contrast the two. So to say something's good means I have to be able to contrast it with evil or with bad, right? Now, this, of course, then sets a limit to what God can do. So, in other words, in the creation of the universe, in the creation of our world, God cannot create good without also creating evil, right? So it also implies on this that evil is not entirely opposed to good. Good and evil are sort of matters of maybe degree. And both of these don't seem like good solutions, right? So on the one hand, we don't want to limit God. That, again, goes towards that omnipotence part, right? Because, well, God is all-powerful. Of course, we could have good. God should be able to make good in the world without having evil. So one might argue, for example, can I have a situation where there's a world in which there's good and just something sort of neutral, right? We go through our day-to-day life, for example, and someone might say, are you feeling good? Are you happy? And sometimes we're not happy, but we're not sad either, right? There's a sort of in-between position where we go, well, I'm in between. I'm fine. I'm good in the sense that I'm fine. I'm not like happy and feeling great, but I'm also not feeling bad. And so couldn't we have a world similarly exist without evil in it? There might be some downsides of things. There might be some bad, but not evil in the world, not truly evil things. And it seems that on this argument, God can't do that. There's no way in which God could have a good, that things could be good without also having evil. And again, do we really want to say that evil and good are just a matter of degree? Do I really want to say, well, some things are evil, but they're really on a scale of goodness, right? There's good on the one hand, there's good on the one extreme, on the other extreme it's evil, and everything just falls on this sort of continuum. And that doesn't seem to be a good response to this argument. Again, in either case, one, it sets a limit, and two, it seems that we have to have good and evil as both being like one and the same, right? On a sort of degree. Another possible response is evil is necessary as a means to good, right? Now, what this says is not that good and evil are on a spectrum or it's a matter of degree, which things are good and which things are evil. What this says is that we need to have evil in order to get to good. So it implies now, again, though, that there's a severe restriction on the powers of God, right? God cannot facilitate a certain end without a certain means. In other words, God is limited, right? God can't get people to goodness without using this means, evil as a means. So that would imply, in some sense, that God is bound by some sort of causal laws, right? So that God in some way is affected by cause and effect. But this conflicts with sort of theistic accounts of God, right? An all-powerful God isn't bound by the same laws as you and I, including the laws of cause and effect, right? And if we look at the universe, sort of the laws of physics, the laws of the universe, right, these natural laws, it seems that God, in fact, if you have that Judeo-Christian conception of God, God can actually do things that go against nature, right? So if you have a natural order to how a disease progresses, and God steps in, performs a miracle, that is, by definition, God sort of acting outside of our natural laws. So this again would imply this severe restriction of the powers of God. God would actually be bound by causal laws. The only way to get to good is through evil. So evil is necessary as this causal connection, which means God can't step outside that. And so we have an omnipotence problem, and it really does conflict with our standard theistic view of God, right? As God is someone who is not bound by the rules that God created. Now, another sort of view is that the universe is better with evil in it. So this is, in some sense, there's a better world than one in which things were always good, where there was no pain, no suffering, and so forth. These evils, if they didn't exist, the world would actually be a worse place. So there's an aesthetic analogy we can make here, right? When I see the ugliness in the world, that just gives me a greater appreciation or a contrast with the beauty in the world, right? So I can look at, for example, at the time I'm recording this, the fires raging in California, and you look at the devastation of the fires, the aftermath, the burnt out trees, and land is barren and so forth. And then I look and you can see the images from the CBS Sunday Morning where they have a moment of nature and you see something in one of the parks out west, and there's a beautiful landscape and snow-capped mountains, and you say, see, it's that contrast. When I look at the destruction on one side and the beauty on the other, I just have a greater appreciation for the beauty of nature, right? The unburned, the unsoiled, disrupted land, the natural landscape. So there's an aesthetic analogy. In this case, then, universe would need to have evil to make those contrasts. There's also an argument from progress, right? The best possible universe is not a static universe. So if there is only good, then there's no movement, right? We don't become better. So the images that I showed you from 100 years ago, and then maybe 70 years ago, and 20 years ago, and so forth, that we can show that we've made progress in the world, right? That the universe, we get better morally. And this is a contentious issue or a contentious claim, but I think most of us would like to think that we actually make moral progress. And so the argument here is that without some evil in the world, we couldn't make this sort of progress, right? The best possible universe isn't static. It's one in which we make progress. And so both of these arguments then start from the idea that evil is needed in some ways in the universe. Right? We need to have evil. Now, what some would argue is that these first order evils are contrasted with first order goods. Right? So we have some evil act, and then we have some good that comes from that evil. Now, what that allows is a second order good that comes from the first order evil. This is sort of the argument Mackie makes, is that this argument, the universe is better with evil in it. In other words, I have some evil act, and that evil act helps me to see a first order good. And that first order good actually, or a second order good, emerges from overcoming the evil. So here's the act, here's the evil. Now some other good has to come in to right that evil. And that second order evil is only possible if you had, or that second order good, I'm sorry, is only there if you were able to overcome that evil. So there's this weird sense, again, in which these second order goods are only possible if we have this evil in the world. But again, it seems that God should get rid of these things, right? It seems that God should be or shouldn't be constrained in this way, that a benevolent God would be concerned with getting rid of all evil. So in case this isn't clear, again, if I give an example, if I see someone who is beating someone else, physically assaulting them, to see that allows for a first order good to be contra. So there's the idea of suffering on one hand and not suffering on the other. So a first order good is not suffering. The first order bad or the first order evil is being beaten. And then there's a second order good that comes about when it allows us or gives us the opportunity to overcome that first order evil, right? So not only does it contrast, so I get that aesthetic analogy. I can see the difference between being in pain on one hand and not being in pain. But then it also leads to a second order good, namely bravery or courage or benevolence, helping someone else out. And so this is the idea that there are these first order and second order goods, right? A first order good is sort of the realization that there's a contrast, and then there's a second order which also is allowed. But this again seems to be that God allows suffering and the contrast with suffering just to get to that second order good. But a benevolent God, wouldn't that benevolent God just stop that first order evil to begin with? Another problem with this is that if there's a second order good, are there third order goods? So can we keep going? Are there second order evils that lead to second order or third order goods and so forth? Do we get into an infinite regress of, this evil contrasts with this good, which allows this good, but there's another evil that also applies to that second order good, so we need a third order good to combat the second order evil and so forth? Can we just have this sort of infinite regress of evil and good acts going back and forth? And again, this doesn't seem like the sort of thing that a benevolent God would allow, right? We don't want to have this constant struggle between suffering and not suffering, right? Why isn't it that God just doesn't want to minimize the amount of suffering to begin with? Why do we need a second order good? Why can't we just get rid of the first order evil? Why can't we stop this? The next objection that Mackie takes on or response, fallacious response, is that evil is due to human free will. So in this objection, the argument goes that without us being able to do evil things, we couldn't have free will. And evil is the result of independent actions of human beings endowed with free will. So evil doesn't come from God. Evil comes from us. So God isn't the problem. God isn't the source of evil. We are the source of evil. It reduces God's responsibility, or gets rid of God's responsibilities. God isn't responsible for evil. Evil is something that comes from free will. So as Mackie states, first order evil, so to give an example, first order evil, for example, pain, may be justified as a logically necessary component in a second order good, for example, sympathy. So we see someone in pain. We know pain is bad, right? That first order good is the lack of pain. And the second order good that results is we learn to be sympathetic. When we see someone in pain, this generates sympathy. That's how we get to sympathy, right? While second order evil, cruelty, is not justified, but is actually ascribed to human beings, and then that beings that God cannot be held liable for. So again, to break this down, if I see pain, a first order evil, and I know that the first order good that correspond, and sort of push that off to the side for a minute, is the lack of pain, right? So, or pleasure, or just maybe just in fact the lack of pain. Now, what is the reason for that first order evil? It's to get to the second order good, right? And that's something like sympathy, for example. So if God wants to implant sympathy in us, and get us to experience, get us to develop sympathy, that good sort of trait, then you have to have that first order evil. But while some second order evil, cruelty, is not justified, but is so ascribed to human beings that God cannot be held liable for it. So cruelty, you can see, is the next level up. We have pain. Pain leads to sympathy. Sympathy, or cruelty, is sort of the response to sympathy, and that doesn't come from God. That's not part of the order, right? God is not responsible. That's something that's coming from us. Now, the one sort of obvious response to this, says Mackie, he says there's some that has to do with other elements of free will. He's going to set that aside for a minute. But the main response is, why couldn't God just make people who always choose good? Right? Why do I have to allow for that second order evil of cruelty just to have free will? Right? That's what it seems to imply. Why can't we just have people who always choose good? Right? You have a choice between good and evil, but your character makes it such that you always choose good. Now, what some argue then is not just that evil results from free will, but that evil is necessary for free will, right? So that God couldn't create us with a character to do good, because that would be in some sense deterministic, right? If God created good beings that, even though they were free to choose evil, never chose evil, that wouldn't actually be goodness. It would be determined, right? That wouldn't, or I should say, that wouldn't actually be freedom, because your characters are telling you to do good. Now, this is a bit odd, because you can look at people and say, most people don't do evil, right? We may do some bad things, we make poor choices and so forth, but if you have a good character, if you generally are looking out for other people, if you're self-aware of your actions, if you reflect on your motivations, people can be good. But the argument here is that as long as you can't do evil, if your character was such that it always pointed you in the right direction, there'd be a problem with freedom. So this becomes the sort of response. Now, if freedom requires that they're good character, so if freedom requires that good character allows us to do bad things that God doesn't control or is responsible for, so let's assume for a minute, if freedom does require that, then this would be kind of weird, right? Because choices that were made that weren't part of our character would kind of be random and not really chosen, right? So if imagine I have a character, a good character that God creates. It says, oh, okay, so God has made a creation in which people, when having a choice between good and evil acts, cruelty or not being cruel, that in order for that to be the case, that action can't come from a predefined character. Right? You couldn't give me a good character. But then if it's not coming from my character, right? If my actions aren't starting from what kind of person I am, then they'd have to be random, right? They couldn't be. So if I'm a generally good person, and in order for me to truly be free, I would have to be able to have these evil acts, but my actions aren't supposed to come from my character. They can't, right? God couldn't give me a good character because that would be deterministic. Then I wouldn't have any free will. But if it's not stemming from my character, then it would seem to be random, right? It would have, and then how can something that's random be free, right? It would be disconnected from me. So this is an odd sort of thing. Now, if I had an evil character, so imagine the opposite. So just contrast this, maybe to make this a little bit clearer, what Mackie's trying to get at, is that if I had an evil character, that would make me do evil things all the time. So the only way that I could have a free will is if my actions aren't defined by me, by the type of person I am. So if I was an evil person, I'd want to do evil things. But in order to be truly free, I would also have to be able to do good things, but those good things couldn't come from my character. Well, then where are they coming from? Are they just random? But how can something random, how can it's like one day I'm acting good, but then randomness is allowed, and so some action I do is not good, and therefore I must be free? But that's weird to say, because we want to say that our actions come from us, right? A good act or bad act stems from my character, and it seems that God could just create people with good characters and they'd still be free, even if they just chose good all the time, right? So the ability to make a person with a good character, so we can imagine maybe 1,000 years in the future where people's characters are such as they don't do evil or cruel things to other people, right? So at least intentionally, right? They don't will to do really bad things. Well, how is this a problem with free will? It's true they could. It's true in some sense that they're not constricted in any way. But when they look at the world around them, they see absolutely no need to do this. The paradox of omnipotence. So the final sort of response that one can give to the problem of evil is this sort of paradox of omnipotence. Can an omnipotent being make things which he cannot subsequently control? And this really goes to the heart of all of these other approaches, right? These sort of responses to the problem of evil. It seems that all of these responses, when we boil them down, really result in the following sort of response to their response. Can an omnipotent being make things which he cannot subsequently control? Again, we're talking in the Judeo-Christian conception of God. And it seems like there's a problem here, right? That at the end of the day, all of these things, whether it's free will or the need for evil in order to get to some goods and first and second order goods, and all of these things seem to boil down to, is it possible for there to be an omnipotent being which then makes a world which that being has no control over? And this is ultimately the problem, right? That you can't hold the omnipotent all-good being and still have this evil in the world, because it leads to this sort of paradox that I create a world with freedom, but I actually can't control that creation, such that evil just sort of seeps in without me being able to do anything about it. I've made something that I've lost control over. And it seems that this becomes a paradox, because both God is, it's the sort of question, can God create a stone so heavy that he himself cannot lift? Well, if God's all powerful, God can create this great stone, but if God can't lift it, then God isn't powerful. There's the paradox there, right? You can't have an omnipotent being that creates something that they can no longer control. But at the end of the day, that seems to be what's happening here, that when we look at this conception of God, that we have a problem. Because if God is omnipotent, then it seems like God should have control, but then it seems that God needs to not have control of something in order to achieve something that God wants to achieve, but God should be able to achieve everything that God wants to achieve because God's all powerful, right? So at the end of the day, what Mackie says is to hold the three positions, right? So we start with there's evil in the world, God is all powerful, and God is all good. Mackie's ultimate conclusion is that you really can't hold all three of those views at the same time, that there's a form of irrationality that goes on when you attempt to reconcile these three positions. Something has to give. Either there isn't evil in the world, good and evil are on this sort of, it's a matter of degree. There's no such thing as good. There's no such thing as evil. They're essentially the same, just in a matter of degree. Or if you're unwilling to get rid of the concept of evil, and I think a lot of us might be, to say that there aren't in fact evil acts, then you've got a problem with the conception of God. So if there is a God, on this account, Mackie would conclude that God is either all powerful but not all good, or not all good, or all good but not all powerful. And so this then is the problem of evil.